scenarios don't exist in other parts of the world, but as it exists in certain parts of the world, but those have to be taken care of. So certain studies which have been done by entities headquartered in a certain country, in some other country, could not have been done in the country where it was headquartered, given the ethical guidelines. And the bad thing about this kind of scenario is, because it's being passed by a statutory body like the national government or the health department or whatever, the entity which is conducting research can always shed responsibility and say we were following the law of the land, right? So, but the law of the land may be land-based, but the body of the human is not land-based. It is kind of, if I am getting slapped, it kind of pains similarly all over. So I will sort of end with 2 more slides. So we need to balance scientific concerns with research ethics. More scientifically valid approach is not always the most ethical, or the easiest one, or the cheapest one, by the way, when more and more research gets funded from a certain source, which also has interest in the outcome of the research being of a certain kind. Individual rights versus public benefit, we talked about that. Inclusion versus exploitation. So this is very interesting in the sense that if that research actually will benefit someone, even the conducting of the research, let's say these are terminal patients, okay, and an experimental drug is being tested, and they have no other way to live, known way, and we of course don't know whether this will work or not. Who are you choosing as the first beneficiary, if at all, right? So it's not only doing bad, it's who you choose to do the first good, if it were actually good. International setting, should ethics guidelines apply universally? So most of the things, some of it might sound as guidelines, it's probably because I believe in those, but you are free to kind of complicate them and question them in your own way, in your own ethical settings. New technologies. However, whatever guidelines we make are only as good, only good for the knowledge and the oppression that exists at present. So they need to be completely, generally updated. So this is the list of kind of the updates of the research ethic codes which have happened with time. The Nuremberg Code, of course, it happened after the Second World War, 1947. And then what was very important is the Helsinki Declaration. Okay. So if somebody is interested, I can mail them this slide. They can look what these individual things mean. But typically, the Helsinki Declaration was extremely important in all of this. For America specifically, the Belmont Report was very important in setting up how they would conduct their kind of research, right? So I will sort of stop there because I had many more slides, but I see I am right at the hour. So now I open it up to questions. Okay, thank you.
There's questions for Dr. Chatterjee.
Anything, there's no stupid question.
I'll ask a question. Sorry? No, I guess you're asking it. Okay. With the giving of the award, similar to what the Radiological Society did to Dr. Avery, I think it was, but I might be remembering incorrectly. Are there any guidelines for professional organisations with regards to granting of awards, taking into consideration earlier research that may have been done after the Nuremberg Code and after the Declaration of Helsinki, but before more modern ethical guidelines or IRB guidelines that are taken into account with more contemporary research?
The only thing which limits professional bodies, which of course are bodies which are not under the purview of law, so to say, right? It's like a private club. And in that private club, essentially what an award is, I decide this year we will crown you. That's what an award is. It's a private club of sorts. The only thing is uproar, which sort of is a move back. How can you be doing this? Right? For example, we have come to know now that torture on prisoners at Guantanamo and various other places were actually vetted through the highest levels of the American Psychological Association. So, in a way, in a sense, they legitimize in a certain way. And I think the part of the problem is this guy was outed. Many people sitting around that table crowning him were not. So in a sense, to call a black sheep really black, okay, that's a bad example, but to call somebody bad, it's also to self-implicate in a certain way. So I think that tension is there, but there's nothing which holds any professional body from saying, yes, he did that, but this was really good work. And I think that's problematic. A very good example is, unrelated, but the creativity of Roman Polanski. Right? This is the film director who is who's a rapist and a pedophile, but he has produced great work, right? And I believe that's my personal thing. You cannot separate them. It's the same person who produces it. So in the sense that if we are to separate it, well then this is fine, right? And I believe there can be enough good films by people who are not rapists and pedophiles. Unless we take a boundary there, we will always move into grey zones. And of course in grey zones, there's no place where we can end, right? So I think the separation is kind of important. In the sense it has to be looked in conjunction. That's my belief. It's just me, Woody Allen. So yeah.
I have a question. It might not be completely related to this, but then liberal democracy, which has been in the Constitution for a long time, and what it
Where?
says
Here?
in America, and also in early Europe. So what it really says is that it protects the individual's right. The law protects the individual's right. But then we see all those things happening later on. So what exactly, I mean, even if there is a guideline, there is a law, what can be done to ensure that this doesn't happen, the exploitation of ethnic minorities doesn't happen?
Good question. And I think the cure of these problems arising in a setup of liberal democracy is greater liberalism and greater democracy. It's not branding liberal democracy as this huge problematic thing, but hey, you got that. For example, at least we know, I have no clue what happens in Saudi Arabia. We won't. So the idea of liberal democracy being the great Satan is problematic. The cure of the problems of democracy is greater democracy. That's always clear. These are all problems of access. Some people, look at what's going on. Some people got to do stuff without other people knowing. That's the huge antithesis of transparency. It's a very pillar of democracy, right? So in a liberal democracy, these were spaces of non-democratic spaces. These were non-transparent spaces. The idea is to open up to public scrutiny. If people were knowing this was going on, there would be uproar. The whole idea that this went on is not because it was liberal and democratic, because it was not democratic. It was not being liberal.
But then, what if the democracy is ruled by people, the ethnic minority that differs in opinions from the ethnic minority? So you open up, well, democracy means ruling of the mass, right?
Yes, but a liberal democracy also means fundamental rights of every individual is protected. Beyond that, it's majoritarianism. But that's the sacred line. Fundamental rights are non-negotiable. Doesn't matter who you are. That's just sacred. If there is one sacredness, that is. Beyond that, what you do is who the faction in power or the part of the mass in power takes care of that. That's the directionality. But you cannot fiddle with fundamental rights. That cannot be negotiated. It's not democracy anymore. That's majoritarianism.
But it has been, if you ask a politician, they would say it's liberal democracy.
The nameplate doesn't matter. Okay? The practice matters. And I cannot take down the practice by showing, hey, that nameplate looks bad. Correct? But it's also, the point is, what do the principles mean? So, if it's majoritarianism, if it kind of affects fundamental rights of people who do not agree with you, that's hardly democracy. Democracy would, in a sense that there's a huge debate which goes on between majoritarianism and consensus-based practices. Consensus may be slow, but I'm not after speed, I'm after justice. So it's how you approach it. But at the same time, fundamental rights of all people are sacred. All people who are in the mercy of the state.
And what about the animal subjects which used in this experiments? So can we apply these same ethical issues for those? Because here we are saying that those minorities, different kind of minorities are used for the experiment. They are getting the pain, but most probably they are not getting the gain in any way. So, but there are chances that after a few hundred, we can imagine that they will get. But what about those animals? We experiment on like clinical experiments and all, and for the medicines, for the drugs which are supposed to be for humans. So what about those?
That's a great question, and I'm not completely clean on this one. Okay? Let me just be. Disclosure is I have killed rats, cats, and monkeys. That's just true in my scientific research. This phenomena I would call as speciesism, in the sense that we are one species, and you look out for your kind, right? Which is not very different in a grade from this. You're looking out for your kind. How do you define the kind? Now, it's a question of where you put that bar, and people have different views on this. Some people would totally be on the fact that no animal research. Wait until you get to a point where you can do it without animal research. Or some people argue that there's enough data from where you can now go on to do modeling, and you do not need to pry open, and kill other animals. I do not know, in the sense that species survival always seems to be the bigger problem. When you think about global warming, etc., that's also a very species argument, in a certain sense. What are we thinking of is us. Largely, we're also talking about dolphins, but largely what we are talking about is us. So I do not have a good answer, a clean answer for that. And I think it is between the push of, let's say, people, but we need medicines, but we need innovations, and the push of people, but you cannot, cut up animals randomly for random reasons, right? So there cannot be, first of all, gratuitous violence. You cannot just because I like to do it. Many kids still do it. They take this, magnifying glass and try to burn cockroaches. If you know what I mean, right? So that's not done. But we are largely a non-vegetarian species. I am. Most people are. So, what if you guillotine and for research and guillotine for food? Non-survival foods, by the way, mostly. Right? So, all of these are questions which are unresolved. Related to that is, are rights de novo things, which come with being, or rights are a thing we have developed with time as a mechanism of preservation of a certain kind of peace and justice. All of these are related questions with unclear answers, but I think what will be practiced in reality, or what is practiced in reality, is sort of the truce line between the different powers as they exist at the moment. Sort of, okay, that's where the line is now. Now if it changes, the line will be there or here. Right? For example, you cannot randomly cut up animals. I'll give you a good example of this shift to the southern world. in primate research, and primates, see there's speciesism, right? We are humans and primates are like us, right? So primate research is frowned upon way more than rat research. Rats are cool. So people do that. So a lot of primate research is ending in Europe and America. Georgia, the Yorkies, has had a huge primate facility. It's one of the last few primate facilities in America, the USA. Britain is having problems, but you also see a boom of US National Institute of Health funded primate research in Indian institutions, which would want to grab that money, right? Garments in Bangladesh, not very different. At one level of outsourcing, you cannot build a Rana Plaza in America, right? But those who cannot build nonetheless want the shirt out of it. So, which is why NIH wants the research which comes out of this primate research kind of has to then produce it to India, where the guidelines are still of a kind where it can go around it in a certain way. Or the guidelines are you can do it here. So it's always the cruise line of where power equations are at this present moment. It's a shifting world.
There's a question over here.
So what do we do with bad data or bad research? Post World War II, even now there is huge debate as to what we could do with all the research that Nazis performed or other such unethical research revealed. When there's data out there, people don't want to take it back. Unlike the politician in Goa, he did say what he said and he took it back, but he didn't really take it back because information property etc. So there aren't frameworks in place that address this enough, I think. And so what are your thoughts?
I can only have opinions on this, right? So you cannot undo bad data. You cannot undo an atom bomb, for example. That's a great example. You cannot undo an atom bomb, but we can sort of collectively say we will not pursue this bad data, or future data will not be of this kind. Okay. How will we decide it? Again, it has to be activism within the scientific community, which is extremely secretive. Secretive because of its jargon. The tongues in which it talks is not accessible. Part of it is kind of an exercise in creating caste, right there. You can't get me, because that kind of stuff. But part of it is also its long institutional behavior. I've learned from my boss this is how to speak. It's not as if I'm doing it deliberately. My dad told me to do this. How do we learn religion? It's exactly the same way. I saw my dad and mom and whoever, right? So again, then we need to then push back against these ideas, so make it transparent, put it out to the people. I believe people, if you democratize it, more voices will come in. If you put it amongst people who do not have an ulterior agenda, because as a scientist, I have a grant to write, I have this to do, I have many kinds of interests which kind of are tying in. So public dialogue with the kind of science that is being done is extremely important. Public communication, this is what is being done, So these are the pros, these are the cons, etc. But also one more thing to remember from the Japanese experiment is unregulated research is often not very useful research. It's it's a free for all, right? So not much of the research was actually done in Japan. The prisoners of war of the Japanese and Germany are very useful research. It's because the rigor of creating a certain thing, that didn't work like that. So it's not as if it's being taken, but many things are. So I wouldn't discount it. It's just that specific example. It's greater scrutiny, greater transparency, and within the scientific community, and people within the scientific community who would like to think that this is how it is, they need to communicate to the public. They cannot just be, this elite club which says, oh, we know this is bad and you are bad guys. That will make you feel good about yourself. I didn't touch the bad stuff. But the idea is to stop the bad stuff from happening, not to just keep yourself clean. Right? Of course, keeping yourself clean is a part of that process, but that's not all there is to that process. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to a bit about some of the
Speak up.
some of the more ethical frameworks about human ownership of their own selves. Yeah, so you brought up family at the last. Consent was a big issue, but also the fact that the family no longer owned the cells, right? They didn't control what happened anymore. And there was a recent Supreme Court case in the U.S. where they ruled against people whose cells were being used, really without their knowledge or permission, right? They didn't own those cells anymore. They didn't belong to them. Does that, are there any more recent ethical issues that have, or ethical support for humans and their ownership of their own cells?
Yes, in a certain different way. I think it's interesting because I misheard you, and that's how it came. When you said cells, I heard selves, S-E-L-V-E-S, right? Not very different in a certain way. And I think in this age of privacy, personal information, etc., a lot of that is coming in. The stuff I do, neuroscience, for example, can scan stuff, your brain, not exactly your thoughts, but thoughts. If you take thoughts to be a product of neural interactions in your brain, they belong to you, right? So at one level, this is a byproduct of your biological self. And if somebody is intercepting it, transmitting it, or getting to know it without you knowing, it's not very different in a fundamental way from somebody taking a cell and doing something else with it. So those debates are coming in, neuroethics and stuff like that. Because now we are in the technological threshold of where some of this can actually be done. If you really think about it, intercepting phones, it's no different. People are exchanging products of their biological self, thoughts, right? Eavesdropping is no different at one level from Henrietta Lacks and what you're doing with it. So now we understand we cannot take cells. Supreme Court has said it, and many other, and I think in many cases where when one place sets a guideline, other places have a pressure to sort of align. It doesn't necessarily come from the US, it has come from the US in many cases, but then it puts the other governments in a alignment mode, if you will. For example, many progressive laws, typically once you do somewhere, it sets up a domino effect. Okay. Especially if it has large acceptability. If you ask everyone, would you like your cell to be taken and things done without your consent, the answer would broadly be no. So I think justice does not always, law courts don't always go with the book, but they also incorporate sometimes, they know what's a huge public feeling. Because law books were often written where large parts of the population were written off. How does it matter what they think, right? But when that decreases, let's say that has, for example, gone down for a very long time in the United States. Because I do not think the United States of today is less democratic than the United States 100 years ago. It's an absurd idea. It's, of course, way more democratic. Okay. And I think that reflects in public policy and court rulings.
Just build upon that comment by Professor Emily, like the patent for the BRCA1, BRCA2 gene test that was being held by the pharmaceutical industry, and that the claim that that patent should be more widely available so the testing could be less expensive and more widely affordable by the majority of the population, even if it is a Western population. Is there a move, especially amongst medical associations and the scientific medical community, that those sort of issues should be more self-regulated rather than having to go to a legal court? I mean, is the legal court the best and most appropriate place for those sort of issues to be determined and judged? Shouldn't that be something that comes more from within the scientific community? Or is the scientific community not capable of self-regulating in that way when there's, I guess, money at stake?
So you bring in various issues which are all contentious fault lines. For example, the proportion of, let's say, in the last 100 years, the proportion of public funding of science has gone down, which means scientists are working more and more with money which people at large didn't provide, but private entities provided. Let me give you a different example, I'll come back to that, in the sense that here's a drug, here's a set of patients. I will put it in these people, do a clinical trial, something is called a randomized, double-blind randomized controlled trial. It's not getting into what it is, it's kind of it's a good model of creating neutrality, of non-biased outcome. And then an outcome happens, whether this drug or this molecule makes some condition better or not. Okay, that's the idea. Very reputed places like Lancet and BMJ, British Medical Journal, have shown in what our studies are called meta-analyses. So you do an analysis, and meta-analysis is you combine lots of such studies and then combine all the data together to see what are the trends. What it finds is it matters where the money came from. Whether a molecule works on a certain human cell to give a certain outcome depends on who paid for that study. I won't tell what happened, I don't know. But that it matters tells you things are very problematic. Which is why at any point of time, I would trust public funded science way more than private funded science. At any point of time. Right? That's one. That's just one of the fault lines. Secondly, what is the relationship of professional scientific bodies and academia with these entities? Right? That has to be seen. For example, in India, I think it's a very useful example, contemporary India, where because there's a government which just came in power, which is intent on kind of projecting how great ancient Indian knowledge was, again, ancient India in quotes, you can almost predict that in the next 5 years, its tenure, there will be way more research on the effect of yoga on dash. Now fill that place up. Okay. There will be way more research funding. So it's not necessarily only private, but also public research of a state with an agenda. Very similar for this idea of Islamic science. Right? Very similar. What does it mean? No clue. Right? So we have to be really then come back to the fundamentals of studying science the way, do it again. Different people should be different. People should be doing it with different agendas. Everybody has an agenda. Let's consider that everybody has an agenda. There are no mutual people. But if people have different agendas, maybe in a summary, some kind of workable idea will emerge. Right? And when people's lives are at stake, especially in medical research, it has to be that minimum. So that's where I would sort of put it. Right? And I think public engagement is extremely important. Without that, because that is the group which can be least influenced. Because you can't just distribute influence like that. The lesser the number of people, easier it is to influence them or to make them work for you.
Do we have any final questions for Dr. Chatterjee? If you could join me then in thanking him for his very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Okay, thank you. you very much, everyone, for coming to the CTS/PPE/Science Maths seminar. Okay, so if you're in the Ethics and Research class, we've got some very interesting information to consider in the coming weeks. There are other topics that we're going to talk about in class as well. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, people.